world government. It simply wouldn't happen. But Mr. Kissinger goes on, and I think he literally then gives us a threat. He says, yes, there will be a new world order, and it will force the United States to change its perception. What he's talking about there when he says change our perception is something called U.S. exceptionalism. There's the belief on the part of the financial elite that the United States is too powerful economically, too powerful militarily, that it needs to be brought down a few notches to the state of, say, a third world country, something in the line of China, so that we can be merged with China and become part of the one world government and become part of a super capitalist, communist, one world dictatorship. But folks, that doesn't have to happen.
People who are endeavoring to
say
establish
no.
the one world order
We can stand up and resist, and we literally can save the world from being driven into
We can't
dictatorship.
expect the American people to jump from capitalism to communism, but we can assist their elected leaders in giving them small doses of socialism until they wake up one day and find that they have communism. Folks, think about it. Isn't that exactly what's happening in the United States of America today under President Obama's policies of redistribution of wealth? Aren't we becoming increasingly day by day a socialist society? And don't we know from history that most socialist societies eventually morph into communism?
Now that we have a basic understanding of exactly how and why the United States is being intentionally driven into economic collapse, we can finally take a look at the solutions. That means we can examine the American Reformation platform. Our elected officials have become an elite ruling class and must be voted out. Meaningful political and economic change is impossible without election reform. That means our first order of business is to vote out all career politicians in the upcoming 2012 elections. What that means is anyone in Washington who has served 2 terms or longer needs to be voted out. Why, you ask? Because our founding fathers in their wisdom knew that if a man could seek office indefinitely, he would be more interested in seeking re-election than in serving the interest of his constituents. The next thing we need to do is get rid of gerrymandering. For those of you who are not familiar with the term, I'll attempt to explain. Congressional districts were set up to give local representation for people in a given geographic location. However, gerrymandering is used to reconfigure those districts in order that the political party that is in power at the time can reconfigure the district in order to give them an advantage in the upcoming election. The next thing we need to do is get rid of lobbyists because they represent the special interest groups, the banks and the corporations, to the detriment of the American people. We need to set limits on campaign contributions because obviously those who can give the most money can buy the most influence. We need to set limits on personal spending on campaigns because we don't want to have situations where multimillionaires and multi-billionaires can buy political positions. Legislators cannot be exempt from any law they pass. Let me give you an example. We have Obamacare, but our legislators are exempt. We have Social Security, but our legislators are exempt. So they don't care if the Social Security fund has been raided because they have their own retirement program. And lastly, we need to back only candidates that pledge to support fiscally responsible policies. That means a return to smaller government, more control in the hands of the states, and less in Washington. Smaller government. The second plank of the American Reformation platform deals with trade reform. We must end our intentionally losing trade policies because the national debt is primarily the result of intentionally losing trade and entitlement programs. That means that the first order of business is to withdraw from the World Trade Organization and renegotiate all free trade agreements and turn them into fair trade agreements. Of 138 industrialized nations, the U.S. is the only one not to have a tariff and not to have tax protection. And that is why our manufacturing sector has been gutted and why we have a huge trade deficit. That means that we have to impose a tariff and we have to impose a value-added tax in order to protect the balance of trade of the United States of America and keep us from going into further debt. The third thing we need to do is eliminate the fast-track treaty process, whereby the normal treaty process is circumvented. The next thing we need to do is make it illegal to incorporate outside the U.S. to reap trade or tax benefits. Let me see if I can explain that. What has been happening over the last several years is that because we didn't have tariff or value-added tax, American manufacturers have simply gone abroad to produce their goods. Now they can produce in China or wherever else they want, and they don't have any pensions to pay. They don't have any health care issues. They don't have any EPA issues. They can use slave labor, and then they can export those products back to the United States and take advantage of the approximately 30% tax advantage that they have as an importer importing into the United States. The net is that our own policies have resulted in the manufacturing of America, leaving America, gutting our manufacturing sector, and those same corporations are then able to benefit by coming back into the country as importers. We have to put a stop to that kind of abusive policy. The next thing we need to do is have non-participation in the SSP, the Security and Prosperity Partnership Agreement, and in the Amero Union. The Amero Union, for those of you who don't know, is an attempt to combine the United States, Mexico, and Canada into one super trading group. And lastly, we need to repeal all laws allowing sale of U.S. infrastructure to foreign investors. It used to be that that was illegal, but then under the Bush administration, he passed a law allowing international banking interest and international private corporations to buy U.S. infrastructure paid for and maintained by U.S. citizens can now be bought by foreign interest. We have to put a stop to that if we are to maintain the integrity of the United States of America. The third plank of the American Reformation Platform deals with financial reform. We need to implement legislation to take issuance of U.S. currency out of the hands of the financial elite, that's international bankers and the Federal Reserve, and put it in the hands of the Treasury and the U.S. people where it was intended to be. At that point, we will be able to reinvigorate the U.S. economy. The first step in this process is to pass a national usury law. Historically, usury laws were at a state level, and then there was a court decision. There were 6 states that did not have a usury law. The court decided that banks could go to any of those 6 states, incorporate, and then charge any interest rate they wanted. That was the birth of predatory lending. At that point, interest rates went from a reasonable 6, 7, 8, or 9% up to 20, 30, and 40%, and predatory lending was birthed. And those least able to pay were targeted. That meant single moms, people in fixed incomes, college kids were all given credit cards and intentionally driven into unmanageable debt. We can reverse that by passing a national usury law, setting an interest rate of, say, 10%, and then the money no longer flows to the banks, but flows to the American people where they can save it and where we can have financial responsibility on a personal level and not be dependent on the state. At this point, I need to tell you that some of the planks of the American Reformation Platform, especially those dealing with finance reform, are fairly complicated. And if you're truly going to understand these issues, you're going to need to buy my book, Modern Slavery and the Fight for Freedom. I'll do my best to explain them, but they simply can't be explained in a brief narrative. The next thing we need to do is change the mortgage laws and tie mortgages to the borrower. That means your name, not to the property. Let me give you an example. Let's say you owned a home, you sold it, bought a new home, and the new home cost $10,000 more than your previous home. Here's how it would work. Your original loan would remain in place. It would remain at the same place on the amortization table, at the same interest rate. You would have a second loan only for the difference, in this instance $10,000 at a new interest rate and starting at the beginning of the amortization table. What this would do would be allow people to pay their mortgages off in a reasonable period of time so that they could save for the future. So we wouldn't be dependent on Social Security, so we wouldn't be dependent on the government, so we the American people, could be self-sufficient. Again, we would take control from the banks and put it back in the hands of the American people where it needs to be. The next thing we need to do is set up a capital investment fund to stimulate job growth. You're going to have to go to my book to read that. There's a lot that's involved there. The next thing we need to do is close the Federal Reserve and establish a national bank. Now, I can just imagine that many of you are saying that that cannot be done. Not so, folks. It was done before. This is the second Federal Reserve. We had a Federal Reserve under the administration of Andrew Jackson and he got it shut down. And in my book, I have a Nobel Prize winner who explains exactly the process that we would need to go through in order to have a systematic, safe withdrawal from the Federal Reserve and the establishment of a national bank. The next thing we need to do is repeal the illegal income tax. There were 6 Supreme Court decisions that ruled that the government of the United States had no right to tax individual income. And we need to get rid of it. And for those of you who don't know, your income tax doesn't go to pay for any social services. It is used exclusively to pay the Federal Reserve for the interest that they charge for printing the currency of the United States. So getting rid of the legal income tax is directly tied to getting rid of the Federal Reserve. The last thing we need to do is reinstate financial safeguards such as Glass-Steagall. What Glass-Steagall provided was the safeguard whereby insurance companies, financial banks, and security companies could not merge. Once that legislation was repealed, that's what allowed us to have the collapse of the real estate market that occurred in 2008. The financial elite, who are behind efforts from the one world government, comprise only 1% of the population, and they have more money than the bottom 95% of the population. What this legislation is designed to do is we must redistribute the wealth from the financial elite, the 1%, to the bottom 99% of the population, which includes the upper class, the middle class, and the lower class. Or in other words, folks, we take the money from the financial elite, from the international bankers, and put it back systematically in the hands of the people. So we are no longer dependent on the banks, and we are no longer dependent on the government. We become, as we were intended to be, self-reliant. The fourth plank of the American Reformation platform deals with health care reform. But before I get into specifics, I want to point out the fact that the government of the United States is intentionally controlling our access to all the necessities of life, not just health care, but access to jobs, wages, food, water, and energy. The strategy is that if they can control our access to the necessities of life, they by default control us politically. But we can fight back. Point in hand, we can fight to repeal Obamacare, because Obamacare is not what it was represented to be. We were